Welcome back, everyone. Let's turn our attention now to paddlecraft safety. Paddling is the fastest growing segment of the boating community. Paddlecraft are small, easy to handle, and can be cheap to buy. Unfortunately, as more and more people buy kayaks and paddlecraft, more are getting into trouble out on the water. Dr. Robin Pope is with us today to give us some pointers on being safe on paddlecraft. Robin is an instructor, trainer, educator for the American Canoe Association in both swiftwater rescue and whitewater kayaking. He currently serves on the National Boating Safety Council and is the division chief of the Auxiliaries Paddling Division. Robin is also the skipper of ship 957 in North Carolina and is a member of BSA's National Aquatic Subcommittee. Robin, the floor is yours.
Bruce, thank you. If you could put the next slide up, please. Slide after that. Great. So as Bruce said, we're going to be talking about paddling and paddlecraft safety today. And we're doing this because paddling is a very popular activity and participation is growing. Participation in kayaking in particular has more than doubled over the last 10 years. Currently, there are about 22 million people that paddle in the US. Unfortunately, as paddling has increased in popularity, we've seen an increase in accidents, injuries, and deaths. And that's sad, but what's even sadder is that all these accidents, injuries, and deaths are preventable through some simple measures. And if we can prevent those measures while people are on the water, it means that we're all going to have more fun while we're out on the water in our paddlecraft. Next slide, please. So today we'll talk a little bit about the ways that you can participate in paddling, talk about some common accidents, injuries, and causes of paddling deaths, and then we'll look at some data-based measures that'll help you stay safe while you're having fun on the water. Next slide, please. So there are lots of ways that you can go paddling. Typical craft include canoes, very popular in Boy Scouting, kayaks, which are the most popular paddlecraft on the water right now. Rafts and inflatables craft are very popular. And then stand-up paddleboarding has become increasingly popular over the last 5 to 10 years. We can paddle all sorts of places. Ponds and lakes are very popular, particularly when people start out. They're a nice, safe place to learn skills. You can paddle on rivers, ranging from the river you see in the picture here, which is a nice, easy one, up through much more challenging waters, class 3-4 whitewater. You can paddle in the ocean, and again, ranging from very easy protected areas to much more challenging conditions. And then you can paddle and surf. Next slide, please. So about 22 million people paddled in 2019, and common accidents included falling overboard, capsizing, and collisions. And when we think of collisions, we often think of a boat running into something else. You'd have to be a really fast paddler to paddle into something hard enough to hurt yourself, though. Instead, in paddling, we're often run over by another boat, and often that's a motorized craft, or we run into debris that puts us in a position where we can't rescue ourselves. Fortunately, the rate of serious accidents in paddling is extremely low, less than a few hundred per year out of those 22 million, but it could be even lower if we were able to prevent some of them. And as I said, most paddling accidents are preventable with some easy steps. Next slide, please. So paddling accidents typically happen for a few reasons, and one of them are simple water and weather conditions. Boaters go out and they're exposed to conditions that are more challenging than what they're prepared for. Inexperience, which leads to capsizing and falling overboard, and that inexperience also leads people to misjudge conditions and accidentally get into conditions that are harder than what they expect. And then collisions, again, with other craft or with on-water hazards. Next slide, please. So how do we prevent these accidents? And if they do happen, what are some steps we can do to manage them? Well, the first thing is to expect to swim. Paddlers are boaters, but one way to remember this is that we're also swimmers who periodically sit in boats. We have to go in expecting that we're going to go into the water and take some steps to manage that. If we're going to go in the water, it's important to know the weather and water conditions. Get a weather forecast, know the water temperatures, and look for water levels. Water levels in the ocean mean that we're going to be checking for tides and currents. If we're going to be on rivers, there are many ways to find what predicted river stages are. You can see on the slide here the river stages for a river near my house, and you can see the day-to-day variation as water flow is changing with rainfall. And this is a dam-released river, so you see daily variations in flow. The big thing to do is know that if the conditions are wrong for your skill level, then do something else. That something else might be delaying the trip. It might be paddling somewhere else. It might be staying on land and doing something entirely different. But if the conditions are wrong for your skill level and your group, it's time to do something else. Next slide, please. The biggest thing we can do when we're on the water is wear a life jacket. Wearing a life jacket is simply the single most important thing we can do to improve our safety while we're paddling, because most people who die boating aren't wearing a life jacket. Over the last decade, 70% of boating deaths have been drownings. 85% of those who drowned weren't wearing a life jacket. Make sure that you're not one of those people. Wear your life jacket. Next slide, please. Part of dressing for swimming, assuming that we're going to swim, is to make sure we're wearing the right clothing. So we need to plan to be in the water. In addition to wearing a life jacket, we have to have proper clothing. Olympic pools are typically 78 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, but that seems fairly warm. But as soon as we get below 70 degrees, we start considering the water cold. Once it's below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, there's a chance that it could be immediately life-threatening. If the water's cold, make sure you wear appropriate clothing. We've got a picture of a wetsuit here. Other options are a dry suit and paddling splashwear. But the colder it is, the more important it is to have high quality paddling clothing. Certainly below 60 degrees, you need a wetsuit or a dry suit. And that might be a time to consider doing something else. Next slide, please. We need to know the features that might make us swim. And some of those features are very obvious. Big waves, fast current. Most people can look at that, and even if they don't know much about water, they understand that 10-foot waves are probably not what we need to boat in. But there are hazards that are less obvious, and one of those is a strainer. On rivers, that's a tree or other piece of debris that allows water to go through, but doesn't let you go through, which means we collide with it and then we're stuck potentially underwater. Another hazard is what's pictured here, which is a low head dam. Water flows over the top of it and then recirculates at the bottom. If you're not experienced, this can look like a really benign feature, but this particular low head dam, I sat and watched for 45 minutes as things stayed stuck in that hydraulic line for that entire time. A boater in there can have a lot of trouble getting out, and that can lead to some unfortunate consequences. So it's important to learn the hazards in the waterways that you're boating and learn how to mitigate them. In this case, the way to mitigate them is to get out of the water and walk around it and get back in below. Next slide, please. One of the hazards is just other boats. As paddlers, we're slow, small, and hard to see. And that means that if we're on open water and there are power boats around that are traveling 20, 30, 40 knots, then we need to be aware of that and assume that they can't see us. That means staying closer to shore, staying on channels, and being in a large group so that it's easier to see a group. Another way to do that is just paddle in waterways where you're unlikely to have motorboats. So this is a fairly shallow river, great to paddle on, but in 2 or 3 feet of water where it's easy to paddle, we're not going to see any power craft. Next slide, please. We also want to develop our skills, and primary skills are going to include rescue skills, paddling skills, and planning skills. Next slide, please. So rescue. Every paddler should be able to help themselves and help someone else. Because capsizing and falling overboard are the primary ways that people get hurt paddling, the primary accident types, every paddler should know how to empty their boat and get back in. And we can see scouts from my ship here practicing emptying their boat in the middle of a lake and practicing getting back in. The time to do this is long before you need it. This is a hot summer day, nice controlled conditions, relatively close to shore, so that if anyone had real trouble practicing, they could easily get to shore and we could assess what was going on. But once they've learned this, we can put it in more challenging conditions. Other things we can do are know how to tow a paddler to shore and then as you learn more and more skills, learning how to roll your boat back up so that if you capsize, you can assist yourself without anyone else around. Next slide, please. So one way to help reduce your risk is just to be a better paddler. So go out and develop your paddling skills in increasingly challenging conditions. Take lessons and go out and practice. You can see this is a much more challenging environment than what you saw on the last slide. The last slide was the middle of the summer. This is early spring. Water temperatures in the mid 40s. I'm in the water here, and yes, I am wearing a dry suit, and yes, it was cold. But that's what we want to practice. Next slide. A big part of our avoiding problems is making sure that we do a good job planning. And we hear all the time that failure to plan is planning to fail. So make sure that you plan your trip. Know where you're going, how you're going to get there, and what the weather and water conditions are going to be like. When you do that, decide the supplies that you'll need, and that might be food and water, it might be rescue equipment. For multi-day trips, it might include camping equipment. You just have to make a decision based on what you're planning. And then it's important to communicate that plan. When you're doing the planning, there are lots of resources. Charts and other navigational tools are obvious, but we also want to think about just speaking with other boaters that are familiar with the area, looking at guidebooks, looking at maps, getting the information that you need before you need it is critically important. Next slide, please. Part of what we're going to plan is the supplies that we need while we're on the water. And we've got a picture here of some things that people might use. It includes rescue and communication equipment. There's a breakdown paddle in there. You can see a water bottle and a granola bar for food, extra warm clothing down on the left. There's a paddling jacket and some fleece and a wetsuit top. Survival and repair equipment. The gray bag up at the top is a combination of a first aid kit and repair bag. That's all in a waterproof bag so that if it floats or is exposed to water, everything's still in good shape. And then obviously a life jacket's important. And you can see a tether on that life jacket there. All of that is things that are specific for the trip. When people are planning the equipment they need, there are two big philosophies. One is to assume that you need the same thing on every trip, always carry everything the same way. The other is to assume that you're going to need different things on every trip, and so you pack differently for each trip. Both of those are appropriate. Making sure you'll have the same thing every time means you always know what's there. Packing beforehand specifically for each trip shows that you know what's there on each trip. Either one is good. The big thing is to be intentional about it and make sure you know what you have. What you have is what you need. Next slide, please. And then clearly filing a float plan is part of communicating what you're going to do. We want to let people know where we're going, when we'll be back, and then what to do if we don't get back on time. For paddling, the float planning should include the number of people that are on the trip and each person's contact information, ideally, the number of boats that are on the trip. So if we do a float plan on a 30-foot sailboat, it's just one boat. But on a paddling trip, it might be 8 or 10 boats. It's one boat, maybe one boat for every person or one for every 2 people. But it's important that we know how many boats are on the trip. We want to know where we're going, when we should be back, and when to be considered overdue. Because if you're 20 minutes late, we don't need to initiate a rescue. But if you're 2 or 3 hours late, perhaps we do need to. So make sure you have a plan that includes when you're overdue and what to do if you are overdue. Next slide, please. There's some take-home messages. Big thing is plan your trip. Make sure you plan it in advance because prior planning helps make sure that we don't have any problems. Part of that planning is knowing the hazards and figuring out how you're going to manage them, recognizing that capsizing and falling overboard are the most common things that are real accident problems. We want to dress to swim, and that means wearing your life jacket all the time. I teach a lot of swiftwater rescue, and our assumption is in swiftwater rescue is that if you're within 10 feet of the water, you could get in the water, you need to have your life jacket on, not just when you're boating, but even when you're walking on shore. You also have to have proper warm clothing so that when you go in the water, you stay warm and able to do what you need to do. Go out and practice your skills. And practicing your skills should be fun, so have fun while you're doing it. Remember that you're slow, small, and hard to see, Look out for power boats. They move much faster than you. And if they don't see you until the last minute, it's hard to avoid collisions. So it's our job as paddlers to stay out of their way because it's much easier for us to see them than for them to see us. And then finally, remember, paddling is about having fun. So go out, stay safe, and have fun. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pope, for that comprehensive overview of probably the most popular on-water activity right now. So maybe a few Sea Scout specific questions. With the growing popularity of paddle sports, is a canoe better than a kayak? Is there a certain type of paddle vessel that's better for a beginner? What's your opinion on the different types of paddlecraft?
Sure. I paddle a lot of different boats and they're all fun. I would say that each one has got strengths and limitations. The most important one is to find one that's available to you and that you can get some instruction in. And that's as long as you can get some instruction and you can get access to the boat, then you can have fun in it.
Oh, great. And kind of going on limitations, obviously from your presentation, something that I really hadn't considered, and I'm sure a lot of the scouts haven't, is we often are focused on weather reports and sea conditions in, sailboats and power boats, but checking, say the river conditions, similar to, is there a small craft warning out? So we would want to reconsider our plans then. But outside of a personal choice within the organization, are there limitations for Sea Scout ships going out on paddling excursions together, say location
Yeah.
or time or number
Mhm.
of vessels?
So within scouting on rivers, the limitation is class 1 and 2 rivers. If you don't have a certified instructor with you, you can go on class 3 whitewater if you have a certified instructor with you. And then class 4 and 5, 5 right now is not permitted, but class 4 is only done with commercial operations and only with rafting. Number of craft is one adult leader per 5 craft is probably what's safest, but within scouting, I believe you can go up to 1 to 10. But it's really a matter of looking at the risks and how you're going to assess that. On moving water, the American Canoe Association has a 1 to 5 ratio, just because we want to really be safe. We really want to make sure we have people available to help if there's a problem. On open water, there are less defined limitations, but certainly I wouldn't recommend that you go paddling in a small craft advisory.
Okay. And maybe one last question. In your experience paddling, you were talking about getting together as a ship and practicing in
Mhm.
safe, calm conditions some of the rescue procedures. Um, what have you seen paddlers have to do in terms of rescue procedures, either for themselves or someone else in a group?
Right. So really the most common thing is for someone to capsize or uh, and either be upside down needing help right then or to capsize and then swim out of the boat. So there are ways to help someone who is upside down before they swim. And that takes a lot of practice to be able to do well. Because you're right next to them, it puts you at risk. So it's important to learn how to do that from a qualified instructor. But the big thing is people swimming out of their boats. And within my scout ship, anyway, we really encourage people to learn how to rescue their own boat and to be able to help others do that.
So it seems the key here is training. This is not something you should just go out with some friends and practice on your own necessarily. You want some guided instruction there.
You want some guided hands-on instruction. I'd compare it to going out and deciding that you were going to take a 30-foot boat out in 15 knot wind, a 30-foot sailboat out in 15 knot winds when you'd never been on a sailboat before. That would be pretty disastrous if you could even figure out how to get away dock. Same thing with paddling. You start out with some instruction and get gradually better over time.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's an excellent, important message because sometimes there's a perception because it's a canoe or it's a kayak that it somehow it doesn't take the amount of experience and training to safely